Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. So if you've been listening to the Emergent Order podcast, you know that I've had several economics and philosophical guests come on and talk about big ideas. During the creation of our new Mises versus Marx rap video, I really tried to seek out people who saw the world through a different lens than I do as a fan of capitalism. And so I was very excited when Anwar Shaikh, a professor of economics at the New School University, agreed to come on and have a really in-depth conversation about his experience and the way he sees the world, because he comes at things from a very different perspective. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Anwar Shaikh. First, Anwar, I really want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me today, because I think we are in a moment, and I think everybody feels it, where it's become harder and harder to have challenging conversations that are productive when people don't see the world in quite the same way. And we don't even take the time now to arrive at any shared values, like the shared goals we want to have.
Right.
And so I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation.
I'm happy to do it.
Well, so for starters, just, you were recommended as somebody who is really an incredibly potent thinker and someone who's very important in the intellectual movement on the, I guess you could say, political left, although I hate the left-right continuum. But that was sort of
me too.
That was your introduction by way of Gary and NYU. How did you, first start to get interested in big ideas? Where does your intellectual story start?
Well, I think as a kid, I was always interested in big ideas because I found them fascinating. I mean, I can think back to when I first heard about Buckminster Fuller. And I really loved that, the idea of building not only geodesic domes, but islands that would, I remember his whole idea was that if you put a dome over a space big enough to hold a couple 100,000, that's what I remember from my kid memory anyway. As winter came, the air inside would be hotter than the air outside, and the whole thing would lift up and fly away. Now, I thought that was really cool. I mean, really nice. And it was a big idea. Obviously, I was very interested in airplanes, not just that they could fly, but how they fly. And I studied aeronautical engineering when I first went to college. And there's no bigger idea than going to another planet. So I was fascinated by all that. I've always been oriented in that direction.
And where did you grow up? What was your sort of...
So my father was first a lawyer and a judge. Then he joined the Foreign Service of Pakistan not long after partition. And when I was 5, we were posted to Turkey.
Wow.
And so I spent 3 years in Turkey, wonderful years. I love Turkey still, though not the current political climate. And then we came back to Pakistan for 3 years, and then we went to New York and to Washington, where I went to high school, then back to New York City, where I went to high school here. And on the day that my parents left, I went to Princeton as an undergraduate.
And when you say your parents left,
well, typically diplomats get posted out every 3 years.
Oh, okay, right.
That's the job. So they had to leave on that day. And so I was taken to Princeton, dropped off. I was 15 years old in a new climate, so to speak. I got used to New York. I was at Stuyvesant High School before that, so I was a real nerd. So Stuyvesant was perfect. But Princeton was a different place, and it took me a couple of years to get used to it.
And that spending that early part of your life moving between very different countries.
Yeah.
What was that like for how you understood, sort of your place in the world? Like you're entering college at an early age, right, at 15, but it's also such an interesting age for how we form who we think we are. And by that point, you've had more international travel than most Americans may ever have in their whole life.
Yeah.
So how did that impact the way you see the world?
Well, the obvious and immediate thing is that I already saw how bifurcated U.S. society was. On one hand, I was a Princeton boy coming from a nerdy school. On the other hand, I was non-white. And Princeton, with its Southern heritage and backgrounds, it had plenty of that Southern view. And I encountered that, I think, more in Princeton than certainly I did in Stuyvesant. And that informed me about what it was like for other people. And at Princeton, I happened to hear Martin Luther King, and I actually met Malcolm X. Surprisingly for me, Malcolm X was invited by the Islamic Studies Department. The man, I remember to this day the name of the chair, whose name was T. Kyler Young, and he had the guts to invite Malcolm X to speak about Islam in his department. And I was dragged there by a friend of mine, and I was very impressed because Malcolm X was very, very committed. He was very quiet, contrary to what I'd heard about him as a sort of raving lunatic, and he was well informed. Now, admittedly, I heard that from the New York Times, but he was well informed, and he is passionate in his beliefs, but quietly so. And that gave me a sense that, the life I'd lived, which was a fairly privileged life, though it didn't insulate me from racism, was all that I wanted, was not sufficient. And it led me towards exploring and understanding what was like on the other side.
And is that what drew you to economics? Like, how did economics come into the picture for you?
I think by the time, when I graduated, I went to Kuwait, where my father was now posted again. And there I encountered a kind of obvious discrepancy between what I was told about development coming from Pakistan and India. These are poor countries, you don't have the money, I'm sitting in Kuwait and they have so much money they don't know what to do with it. It's literally gushing out of the ground. And they were spending it freely. Since my father was a diplomat, I met all the people who were wealthy in Kuwait. And it seemed to me that I also saw poverty in Kuwait. My parents believed strongly in that you should work. And at Princeton, I worked on a laundromat. In Kuwait, I worked as an engineer in the desert. And that's a hard life, John. It's 130, 140 degrees in the sun. You can collapse from that, not to mention sandstorms. Here are all these people working desperately for making more money there than they would at home. And I thought, Kuwait doesn't need to pay these people so little. It has so much money. It literally couldn't figure out what to do with it. Why are they not better paid? And that started me, I think, on this path of not accepting what you're told about the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, in a lot of ways, the first time I came to become sort of actively engaged in ideas as a young adult was sort of recognizing the injustice in the drug war in the United States, because I'd gotten out of school and I happened to not be particularly, I'm frankly more rebellious now than I was as a teenager or as a kid.
Yes.
And I met two types of people who had had experience with drugs when I moved to New York City. And so I met, well-off peers who had done all kinds of things in high school in Greenwich, Connecticut, and Long Island, and I would ask them like, "Well, how did you get cocaine in high school?" And
Yes.
I was so naive, and I said, they said, "Well, it was actually easier to get cocaine and marijuana than to get alcohol."
Wow.
And then I similarly met folks who had, come up like living in the projects in Newark, and had friends whose lives were destroyed for handing an envelope to somebody else across the street and getting picked up by the police for doing that.
Yeah.
So it that was really in a way the first, because I was raised pretty conservatively, and I'm Italian Catholic, and so it's sort of a conservative bent sort of in the core, minus that Southern Italian skepticism, the Sicilian in me. Right. That's probably where the rebellious streak comes from. But that was the first time I sort of came to see like, just because there's a law, even if that law seems to maybe have some moral grounding, it doesn't mean that it actually works or is good.
Yes, exactly.
And that just because it makes a moral claim, like drugs are bad, don't do drugs, drugs should be illegal.
Right.
The outcomes can look nothing like that. And they can take, when reality and the law are so divergent, it creates this sort of mischievous playground. And that really, that was kind of the first crack in the door to thinking about, I guess you could say like the economic way of thinking, like asking and then what? It's like, okay, so there's what's asserted, and then you have to start saying, okay, well, what happens next now that you've said that?
Right, exactly.
So
I don't think I came to that stage till graduate school because I didn't know any economics.
Oh, I'm sure I'm projecting backwards.
We all do that.
Yeah, I think at the time it was just like, well, this just seems stupid, and I don't understand it.
Yeah,
that was probably
the injustice of it. Is something you feel strongly when you're young, if you care, and I certainly felt that.
So economics starts to come into the picture. Like, when does it become an actual formal effort for you?
Well, so I'm in Kuwait and trying to figure out what to do. And I'm interested in how things work. I mean, that's how engineers are anyway. And so I'm thinking of going into psychology. And at a cocktail party at my house, and diplomats basically spend a lot of time in cocktail parties, I met a man who was a consultant, and he said, "Oh, I think you should go to economics." So I said, okay. And so I applied to graduate school. I applied to Colombia and University of Texas because I had a Texan girlfriend, and that seemed like a good idea. And that was just when that young man got up in the tower in Texas and shot all those people. Right. And my parents were saying, "No, you're not going to Texas." So it was Colombia. That was it. You know how life is full of these accidental moments that determine your whole future? And that determined mine. That
was it. The good old overestimation of low probability events.
Exactly.
There was a shooter. There probably won't be another one for a long time, but no, forget it.
There's no way I was going to argue that with my parents and win. So,
and what was the intellectual environment like at Columbia? I know that especially in economics departments, there tends to be schools of thought, right? The Chicago school, or
right.
The Virginia sort of public choice school, or like where did Columbia exist in this world of sort of schools?
Okay, so you have to remember this was a long time ago. Now, I got into graduate school in '67, and Columbia still had a mixture, what we call Keynesians. Probably they were the dominant form for macro.
Sure.
My macro teacher was a man named Arthur Burns, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors, I think, under Eisenhower.
Now, is this the Arthur Burns who becomes the chairman of the Fed under Nixon?
Yep.
Oh.
I think so, yeah.
All right.
And he used to say, you have to understand economics so well that you could teach it to children, idiots, and even U.S. congressmen. So
in no particular order of capability.
Right. Well, they were below idiots. So, and he was a good teacher. So that's one side. I had a teacher who taught Alexander Ehrlich, who taught about the Soviet industrialization debate. He was Polish, and he was not pro-Soviet, but he gave us a history of what those debates were about. I had another teacher who taught about China, was still a major China expert. And then I had Gary Becker, microeconomist, and Bill Vickery, the microeconomist.
Oh, so you really had a diverse group of intellectual...
Very diverse. And Vickery's course was a first-year course, and if you did well, you got into Becker's course, which was a really hard course. Vickery's was hard because he was kind of a strange guy, but Becker was really hard. And I liked those courses. But something intervened at that point, which is important. 1968 was a strike. Strike at Colombia, strike in Mexico. Berkeley had already done the free speech movement, strike in Paris. And I joined that. It sort of seemed like the logical place for me to go, given my sympathies and given my feeling about, the reality was very different than what people said. And so I joined the strike. It was led by SDS, which is undergraduate. And I think there were only one or two of us in graduate school who joined the strike. But, I was walking past it one day, and there was this guy who was hitting the protesters with an umbrella. I think, by the way, John, he was an Austrian.
by nationality?
I can't remember his name, but no, by theory.
Oh.
There was a group, an Austrian economics group on campus. They were conservative. He was dressed in a suit. And so I thought, okay, either I walk.
It's not very non-aggression principle of him, I must say.
Well, people are emotional, everybody's like that. So I joined. And I think that also changed my view. Didn't change it, it solidified my view.
And how would you sort of, what is that view at that point in your life? Like, what are you coming to see the world as being? Take a snapshot of that moment.
So what you said earlier about injustice, that was easy to see. The strike in Colombia came because Columbia University wanted to use a park in Harlem to build a gymnasium. And on the other side of that park was Harlem. And they probably would have fenced it off and not had them even have access to the park. Now, the park was pretty dangerous. I got mugged there, so I can tell you from experience. But it didn't belong to Columbia. And so that was the immediate motivation. But I think it was just it was the 60s, it was the late 60s. It was a boiling over of impatience with the war, with the hypocrisy of people in power, of the cowardice of our teachers. Some teachers were great, but many didn't say anything or do anything. And it was that one major aspect. And the other was with these wonderful teachers like Becker and Vickery, I didn't believe a word they said. That was a real problem, in graduate school. I'd come, as I said to you, I lived in all these different countries, all these different cultures. In Pakistan, India, there are many different cultures coexistent, even languages. How could you possibly portray human beings as rational economic men? It made zero sense to me. I couldn't even understand why you'd want to do that, not to mention what you mean by rational.
Yeah, and this is maybe a great place to turn to some of your work, because again, as a super interested non-economist, I don't have any formal economics training, but I can fake it.
That's good. Then you're free from the damage to your brain that comes from being an economist.
Well, I think it might have been Hayek who said something to the effect of, the economist who is only an economist is no great economist at all, or something to that.
I think absolutely right. Any economist who doesn't start from the world is really in ecclesiast, and that's not a good way for an economist to proceed.
And so, help me understand what you understood to be the teaching, because I know some of your work maybe doesn't begin here, but some of the work that you're noted for is your criticism of perfect competition. And so this might be, so I'm gonna take a crack at summarizing it as I was taught it in high school, which was the only economics class I've ever had formally.
Right.
So what I remember in high school economics, which was taught by the football coach, by the way, was,
that's great.
Well, you have these different models of competition. You have perfect competition, which is an infinite number of suppliers and an infinite number of demanders, and all profits get competed away. So it's a true like synthetic ideal. It's something that only exists on a blackboard. And then you've got everything, and then you've got monopoly on the other side, or monopsony. So you either have one supplier or one buyer. And then you've got all these things in the middle that are all kind of imperfect, monopolistic competition or oligopoly, and they're all sort of these not perfect markets. Is that a fair summary of the?
That's an excellent. I wish my graduate students did as well. You had a great teacher, and you're obviously smart. But this covers essentially the frame of economics. Plus, of course, that people are supremely self-interested and bizarrely rational, so-called, in their behavior. So that's the other side of this thing.
Yeah, we didn't learn about that in high school, but I've subsequently heard this. People they seek to maximize utility. That we're always sort of utility maximizing. Okay, well, all right.
Right.
How should I spend my next hour of time that will maximize my utility?
Right.
So what is the implication?
I have to say, in high school, with all the emotions running through you, there's no way you're going to fall for the idea. That's what you do. Yeah. It wouldn't work. I've taught in high school. It wouldn't work.
So what's the problem? What's the problem? Like, what is the problem with that? What are the implications of it? And kind of where did you take your work surrounding this these models of competition?
Okay, let's start with the consumer, because that's how you start a micro course typically. That's how everybody starts. So what you begin by saying is utility maximizing, and a selfish individual, and perfect knowledge, and unable to affect their environment. And utility maximizing, well, what goes into your utility? Things, consumption goods. Does your mother go into your utility? Oh, no, that's an externality. I'm thinking, what the hell is this? What kind of bizarre sociopathic individual is a person who doesn't care about anything except the things they get? That, by the way, is a formal definition of a sociopath. And I could already see that that's totally wrong. I began to take courses in anthropology simultaneously, in economic anthropology, which is pretty bad, and then real anthropology, study of society, study how people behave. And it was not hard for me to understand that. I came from a culture with multiple people side by side. My best friend in Pakistan was a Zoroastrian. My best friend in high school in Washington was Chinese. My best friends in Stuyvesant were Jews, American Jews. And my best friend in Princeton was also at that time Jewish. But there's no way I could stuff those things into this absurd framework. So right away I began to think, well, this framework is absurd, but why is it absurd? Why is it abstracting? And later when you take the second part, perfect competition and the firm is passive and all that, then they put it all together in welfare. Capitalism is the ideal system, the best of all possible worlds. And it seemed to me, I was not only didn't believe it, I was insulted by it. Yet these were very smart people. Excuse me, let me turn this off. So here are these smart people who clearly knew about the world in some sense. And on the other hand, they had this commitment to a framework. I could not understand it except in terms of religion.
Can you help me? If I want to make sure for someone who is listening and doesn't have access to the jargon. So why? What is this model, this perfect competition idea? How does that relate to capitalism or the argument for capitalism? And because nobody thinks that there's a world in which there's an infinite number of competitors or an infinite number of suppliers. So why does something so abstract like that play a role in the argument for, quote, capitalism, leaving aside all the weird ways people define these terms?
That, right. Well, because it's the foundation of the idea of welfare, of utility maximizing leads to a maximum satisfaction for each individual subject to what they have. Nobody asks, how come someone in Harlem has a different amount of money or education or wealth than someone else sitting at the top of the hill at Colombia. That's economists say, well, we take that as given. And I'm thinking, well, what kind of social science takes that as given? Then the other side is the firm. The firm is passive. It takes the price as given, and it seeks to maximize its own profit, the dual of utility. Mathematically, you can write them in the same framework, basically, subject to a cost constraint, which is just like the individual. And from there, you get this idea of perfect competition. And then you, as you say, you have a spectrum between that and monopoly with everything shoved in between to try to accommodate real phenomena. But that's a trap. It's a trap just as much as the individual ideal consumer is a trap. But when you begin to understand, it's not an accident. It's the way that you portray capitalism as the ideal system. Now, is that not similar to religion? Is that not similar to the idea that we had an ideal state sometime in the past in the Garden of Eden, and that from there we fell out of that state, and now we're full in a world of imperfections? Well, I went to Catholic school. That was not hard for me to figure out, to see that analogy. And I thought, no, this can't be right. And as an engineer, you also learn to see, how things work. So one of the things immediately that I had to deal with is, if this is an abstraction, what's wrong with that? After all, abstractions are part of the beginning of any kind of thinking, so you have to have an abstraction. But the more I studied science, the more it became clear that it's not sufficient to have an abstraction. The abstraction has to be grounded in the real. The Catholic Church said, as an abstraction, that all planets have circular orbits because that would be most pleasing to God. Now, that's an abstraction, right? It's not that bad an abstraction. But when confronted with the actual behavior of orbits, they realized they couldn't account for it. So what did they do? They started to add imperfections in the orbits that are called epicycles, circles around circles. And this way they were able to explain the observed pattern, but they needed a new epicycle for each planet, for which they had no rationale at all. And this is exactly what imperfect competition is. It's an epicycle. And it's not enough to say, well, it's an abstraction. There are other abstractions. Part of my work is to show you that you can have another abstraction which doesn't need to say that the real is imperfect. The real may be more concrete, but it's not imperfect. And so that's really a question of science. I use this analogy. Forgive me for ranting on here,
please.
But just to finish this. When I taught science, which I did in Kuwait, I taught physics. One of the things you try and explain is the law of gravity. Now, the law of gravity is kind of bizarre from your experience, because the ideal form of the law of gravity, the ideal expression, meaning the most abstract expression, is when you have a vacuum in which you can drop a ping pong ball, table tennis ball, and a steel ball, and they'll fall at the same rate. Now, you can find that on YouTube, by the way. It's pretty cool. Even a feather. And that's astonishing. But that does not mean that it's desirable. That's an abstraction. Who the hell would want to be in a vacuum? It certainly wouldn't work for us. So what Newton does is, okay, that's the base. That's the law of gravity. Now I have to introduce a fluid into it that makes it more concrete. Depending on the fluid, these two objects will fall differently. If the fluid is air, okay, the ping pong ball will fall more slowly. If you fill it up with water, the ping pong ball won't fall at all, and the steel ball will fall more slowly, but still will get there with the first one won't. Now, if you're an aeronautical engineer, this is so trivial and so obvious that you move from the abstract to the concrete by adding further factors, but it cannot contradict the original factor, because then you don't have a good place to start. So that's science. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this is not science. This is closer to religion. And once I saw that, then of course my work began to try to find a foundation. And here I have to tell you something really interesting. Becker was a superb teacher, really great, very hard. And one day after he'd made us suffer for months going through utility maximizing, profit maximizing, these marginal this, marginal that, he then comes into the class and gives a lecture in which he shows that all these results can be derived without any of the assumptions whatsoever. And my jaw was on the floor. If that was the case, why were we doing all this? He did what I call now stochastic economics, and it was a very simple principle. Any one person behaves in a variety of ways. I mean, a group of people. We don't have to say they're all alike. They're not. They don't even behave all alike in the 2 times they go to eat or talk or so on. But if we collect them in an ensemble, as the physicists say, their collectivity has stable patterns. And that is sufficient to say that if you lower the price of something, some of them will consume more. Doesn't have to be all. Just the average moves in that direction. You lower the income, some people will consume less. And that's the basic laws of microeconomics. But you don't need any reference whatsoever to optimality, to utility, to satisfaction. Nor can you say that that move is something that makes people better off. It doesn't. That's just the reaction of the mass, so to speak. And I realize what advertisers do. I can't believe any advertiser would believe for a second this absurd model that we teach in economics, because their job is to influence people. That's the job. And they're very good at it. So why do advertisers not believe it? Why not engineers don't believe it? Why do normal people not believe it? And why do economists believe it? Because it's drummed into our heads like instructions in the army. And after a while, you forget that the instructions are not good, they're not meaningful, or perhaps even terrible, because they become part of your thinking. And that's what religion does too, repetition. But I don't believe in that.
So lay out what the alternative that you put forward to this this abstract model, this idea that the ideal is perfect competition, and what was your alternative? How did you create something here, more holistic, more realistic?
I already said in the consumer behavior, my teacher Gary Becker had already given me the path. I need to modify it a little bit, which I did. I sat on it for 40 years, but it was a thing of beauty because it showed you can derive all the consumer stuff without any of that. And, I know perfectly well from social life, anthropology, that people have many complex factors that determine their behavior, including loves and hates and all of that, and politics and nationality. So all you need to assume that their behavior is stable within a certain set of circumstances. Not if they're going to be in a revolution, not if they're trying to overthrow the government in Hong Kong or Cairo, but normally. So that's enough, because nobody would deny that these laws don't apply when something disturbs the social structure. Then the firm. What do firms do? Well, in the theory of perfect competition, firms take prices as given. And you say, well, who gives them? And these are, by the way, famous microeconomists at Harvard and Cambridge have said this. There's no one to give them. If you assume that every firm takes it given, there's no agent. The opposite of that is to say firms set prices. But now in neoclassical theory, that means you're in the domain of oligopoly and monopoly. Because in perfect competition, firms are totally passive. They just take prices given and they adjust their quantity to make the maximum profit. So my beginning point, which is what, by the way, I get not only from the classical economists, but also Harvard Business Review. If you want to talk about what firms do, why don't you read about what is said by people who study firms? And the answer is pretty clear. So, I mean, obviously firms set prices. How's your bodega owner going to know what the price is? How's your fruit seller going to? They set the price. If the price is too far away from everyone else, they lose customers. If it's too low, they get more customers, but they lose profit from the lower. So there's a dynamic there. And you can easily show that one of the implications of that dynamic is that there's a rough equalization of prices. But that doesn't mean everybody's happy, because firms with higher costs are going to suffer from that. So that's the first thing, firms set price. Second, if they set prices, the advantage in this battle comes from those who have lower costs. If I have lower costs, I can set my price to the point where it can make you bleed, if not kill you. And the damage to me is less than the damage to you. So already we're talking now of real competition as warfare. The absolute most common description of competition in the business literature. It's a war out there, folks. So we've left this ideal world and we're talking about a real world in which technical change and anything else to lower your costs is great for the firm. Well, but then lower wages are good for the firm, aren't they? So if you can keep workers' wages low, that's great. A higher length of the working day, 14, 16 hours as they do in China, great. But that was also what we did in the US and in England. Read Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England. It's a stunning document, but it's a fact. That's how capitalism started. All right, so longer working day, lower wages, mechanization, replacement of workers by machinery that can move faster and faster. The great exemplar of that, of course, is Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, when he's working on that assembly line. And they get a call from above. They keep saying, faster, we need more profits, faster and faster. And he's trying to keep up with it, and eventually falls into the machinery, a perfect metaphor. So I come from an engineering background going, okay, this is how it works. Why should I treat this as imperfect? Why don't I treat it as real? And then from that, you can start to derive implications. And those implications match what we see. I don't need to accuse the real. I need to understand it. And that has always been my understanding what science does. Physicists don't say, oh, okay, quantum effects are imperfect. I mean, they'd be laughed out of the room. They are the real.
So what are the implications there? So you've laid out a couple things, and I'm reserving my dialectical pushback until I make sure I fully hear out the what you're putting forward. But so you've said, like, so firms have strong ability to set prices for the products they offer, but
they must set price. There's no one else to set their price.
Lower prices are the source of the advantage, and so anything you can do to lower your costs, I should say lower costs, are your advantage. So if you can lower wages, or you can extend the workday, or you can replace laborers with cheap machines, awesome, all the better. And competition is contentious war. So what are the all of these seem like reasonable observations. So what's the implication there, and why is it, and how is it different from what the classical or the neoclassical sort of economists that were teaching you were putting forward? What are the implications?
The point of perfect competition is that firms don't do anything against each other. Each firm in perfect competition is passive and gets a signal from whoever it is sets the price, and they adjust their quantity to it. At no point do they take into account the behavior of others. No point do they say, well, I want to kill this other firm, I want to take their market share. That's already excluded. And then you bring it back a little bit when you get to oligopoly. So why would you want to start with that? Why don't you start with the fact that they already are in a war?
And so what's the implication?
Their behavior is determined by that.
Yeah, well, how does that impact people? So, whether, like, where do we go from there?
Okay, let's start with the impact on people. one of the impacts is on workers. Historically, the struggle for a 14-hour working day, and then a 12-hour working day, and then a 10-hour working day, and then Sundays off. These struggles come from this pressure. Capitalists are, in my opinion, it's nothing to do with their personality. It's due to the circumstances in which they find themselves. They're in a war, and one way they have a better chance of survival is to beat down efforts of workers to keep them at a minimal level, and also work them as long as they can until the resistance rises. So that's one side, and it's a very important social history because the whole struggle for the length and intensity and wage of a working day took a long time, maybe a century. And you can track this. It's extremely well known how they managed to get the working day to what we call normal 8-hour day. It wasn't normal. It was 14, 16 that was normal. Moreover, when you go where this social structure has not evolved, like China now, they work 14, 16 hours a day, and they work for very little money. And sometimes they work to the point where they're physically damaged by it. But that's not because Chinese capitalists are worse than American capitalists. It's because Chinese capitalists don't have the same restrictions that American workers have been able to impose, and society and the state has been able to impose. So if you want to talk about competition, that's what it does. But who wants to then go back and say, yeah, your father should work like that, or your child should work like that? That's the point. We actually support all of this, but we forget how it came about. So that's one side. The other side is the impact on firms themselves. It's a war. So if it's a war, some win, some lose. Losers may actually be wiped out. I mean, you lose everything if you're wiped out, unless you have some background. But losing also means that the people whom they employ lose through no fault of their own. If a capitalist makes a bad decision, she or he will be in trouble, but their workers will be unemployed. And so the whole structure of the whole historical movement towards a welfare state comes also from this side. If we're unemployed for no fault of our own, then somebody should be taking care of us because we're taking care of the society. Their work is what keeps society going. And so this brings up the notion of the welfare state. And the welfare state comes again through struggle, not because of some genuine sort of noblesse oblige of the German parliament or British parliament or whatever. It comes through bitter struggle, and this is extremely well documented history.
So and I'm by no means an expert in Marx, but I detect a similar thread to your story in this, seeing sort of the economic life as being class struggle. You've used the word struggle and war and conflict. Is that fair? Did you find that this was in harmony with sort of the Marxist form, the Marxist arguments for exploitation, or how is your approach different from what we hear from Marx about the class struggle?
Okay, so what we hear from Marxists is not what we hear from Marx. That's a very important point. What I hear from the church is not
we could probably take 4 hours on that alone, and
yes, exactly.
but in a broad, in a stylized version, which is that Marx analyzes society in terms of these sort of classes, workers, owners or capitalists, and that the conflicts are between these groups more so than they are among them. Is that?
I didn't say that. In fact, I wouldn't say that. What I said is that there is a conflict driven by the pressure and conflict on capitalists, on firms, to keep their costs down. And to do that, they have to struggle at both ends because they can lose if their costs are not as low as others.
No question about it. Yeah, no question about it.
And so that motivates them to push down, and workers, if they're able to, push back. But it also motivates them to kill each other. I mean, that's the first thing Harvard Business Review will tell you. It's bad. They're busy trying to take away each other's market share. They're trying to close each other down. And the one who takes that job has to do it, or they have to move on to being unemployed or finding a lesser conflictual environment.
So if I'm a buyer of smartphones, and I think we can all observe that Apple and Samsung want to kill each other.
Yeah.
And those are both abstractions, obviously. Apple is a bunch of paperwork. Apple, there are people in Apple, and so it's, we talk about even firms as if they're people that have desires, but that's sort of a shorthand.
Yeah, exactly.
But so Apple and Samsung want to kill each other, and they want to, and one of the best ways to do it is to undercut each other by wringing out every nickel of cost they possibly can.
Right.
How is that not good for me and for every single person who wants to buy a smartphone? Why is that a bug? It sounds hard, and it's certainly hard on the competitors at all levels, but isn't the whole point to create goods and services, and the beneficiaries are the consumer? I didn't really hear the consumer or the customer in your story.
Okay, so let me respond. Let me elaborate on that. It's not true that consumers only want lower prices. Would you have bought wine from Nazi Germany because it was cheaper?
Well, sure.
Would you have bought?
Surely not.
No, I mean, of course, that's the point. People are not motivated by greed. They're motivated by a complex series of responses and emotions, and a lower price is only one of them. If I came into a working class town and I said, John, the new company's coming in, it's going to give you cheaper smartphones, but your family and your friends are all going to be unemployed. I mean, it's such an obvious point. Why does economics mystify us by saying that that's the only thing that counts?
Well, I'm not saying that's the only thing that counts. I'm saying that what I'm asking is, it's usually not the case that the choice we make is that dichotomy, right? So I don't work in the smartphone industry. I actually don't know anybody who works directly in the smartphone industry. The number of people who buy smartphones, but there's billions of people who buy smartphones, and there's maybe a couple million at most who are impacted by the smartphone industry as employees, and yet that warlike competition between Apple and Samsung benefits the billion buyers of smartphones. Even if it makes life harder for some of the suppliers, right?
Well, it's not the suppliers. It's the people who work there. I mean,
I'm including all the way down the chain. I'm talking about, not just the owners, but the people who work at Apple, the people who work at the factories, everybody involved. The grandmother who put her pension funds in Samsung stock, everybody involved. Right.
And the grandmother who lost her job in the Samsung company. You can't do it just on the side.
Absolutely.
But so let's why does Apple not produce in the U.S. if it's so interested in serving U.S. customers? And Steve Jobs told you very clearly.
Way too expensive. No one would buy it.
Exactly. Yeah. Way too expensive. So those workers don't have jobs here, and Chinese workers do. And one cannot complain, therefore, that China is doing this, taking free trade, taking jobs away from us. China is not taking jobs away. Steve Jobs is taking jobs away from us. And that is because in order for him to do what he did, which is iPhone is an incredibly powerful, marvelous device, he had to do it in a way that would enable him to survive. And then, of course, Samsung breathing on his neck, and they have to do the same thing. So what did they do? China's working day is 14 to 16 hours. The wage is $2.35 an hour. Their standard living is about 1/30th, even though the goods being cheaper in China. And they are often driven literally to physical breakdown. Now we say, oh, that's great. I mean, fine, I have a cheaper iPhone. What do I care? Well, I think not only that you should care, I think people do care. And that becomes clear when they associate something with that outcome. Blood diamonds, grapes from South Africa. I mean, people historically respond to this all the time. Don't support Nazi products. I remember when they said don't support Soviet products.
Now, to be fair, Anwar, I think there's a big difference between. I don't think it's a fair comparison to say, well, don't buy Nazi products versus, I mean, the Nazis were this murderous regime, and the people working. Let's make an assumption here for a minute, which it may be an incorrect assumption, but let's imagine that everyone involved in working in the supply chains of Samsung and Apple are there voluntarily. They believe that this job that they have, whether it's mining lithium or designing icons, is their best option. They're there by choice. That's a very different underlying structure of decisions and relationships than blood diamonds or products produced in slave labor camps, right? I mean, I don't think just because there's contentious competition, that doesn't therefore mean that we've got the scenario you're describing. I think there's a bit of a false equivalency you're putting forward there, isn't there?
Well, no, I don't think so. But here's the reason why. Why is it that U.S. workers are not working under the same condition as Chinese? How far do you think anyone would get if they said, look, we're going to bring this back, as Trump frequently says, we're going to bring them all back to the U.S. And any real economist, including any real business person, say, oh, you're really going to cut jobs to $2.35 an hour? You're going to make them work 14, 16 hours a day? They'd be out in 10 seconds. And the reason is because American workers over 100 years have managed to secure a standard living which cannot be forced back so easily. Maybe it does, immigrants do that kind of work, intense work at low pay. But unions have always struggled to fight against that. Now teachers are back on strike. It's not true that I have to accept that because they accept it voluntarily and they don't have any choice about the conditions, that I should be passive about the conditions. I totally support an 8-hour working day. I totally support wages. I'm not saying all wages are good or all unions are good, surely not. But I support that long historical fight. And if we don't understand that and say, well, we're only concerned with lower prices for ourselves, then I think we've sort of fallen out of the social web. At least we're taught to do that. I don't think we're actually like that, by the way. But we're taught to believe that that's all you can do.
So if you'll humor me, I want to offer sort of my...
Oh, no, let me just make one more point.
Sure, please.
This has to do with the effects of free trade.
Yes, yeah.
What we're talking about is actually an effect of free trade. U.S. exports of technical goods, which was, U.S. was a leader, have dropped off in the face of all this competition from abroad. Well, that means some set of people have not only lost their jobs, they've lost any future. And these people are angry. And they are absolutely right to be angry. Trump supporters are right. I've never argued that Trump is sort of inflaming them wrongly. On the contrary, he's speaking to their real grievances. And it's not surprising that a significant support for Bernie Sanders comes from the same group of people. We have not been talking to them. Economists have to have the responsibility for understanding how economies work, not trying to present them in a kind of fake and idealized way. And this is how they work. Maybe you like it. Maybe you say, okay, the hell with the workers. So what? I got a cheaper iPhone. That's fair. But it's not fair to say that it doesn't affect other people. You have to say you don't care, or you don't think the harm is as great for them as the benefit of a cheaper iPhone is for you. That's an argument one needs to make.
So before I try to lay out the alternative, the way I understand it, way to think about these relationships, and hear you beat me up for it, which will be great. I'm excited for that. What?
I'm not trying to beat you up. I'm trying to persuade you. You know that.
But yes. But so what is your alternative to competition as a mechanism for economic progress or economic discovery or motivation to improve things, improve the way you do things, improve the way you provide things? What's the alternative to competition?
Okay, let's start with what you just said, to improve things. Innovation. History of innovation is a history of tremendous technical progress and the production of remarkable growth and high standards living, but it is also a history of destruction and displacement.
Yeah, creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter.
Well, yeah, it's creative for a professor, but it's not so great if you happen to be destroyed. If professors gave up tenure, I'd be a little bit more sympathetic. I don't want to give up my tenure, by the way, either.
Very few of us have this tenure thing that you speak of in the university.
But it's therefore very easy to sit in your ivory tower and call it creative destruction. I have worked, by the way, in Harlem. I've worked in, as I said, a laundromat, so I have something about these things work. Innovation doesn't just improve. It also damages. And that's an important, hugely important point. You can innovate by making something cheaper. You can also innovate by making something cheaper that's not good. Heroin has gone down tremendously in price, by the way. So has cocaine. So has crack, because of innovations. There are new drugs being produced all the time, which are cheap and very powerful. Tobacco was very cheap thanks to large-scale production. So one can go through that list. You have to say, what is a benefit, which is not the same thing as an innovation? And what is an improvement? What is rather a degradation?
Well, and there's no one answer, right? Because we all value different things. So
exactly.
For some people, an improvement is having unlimited access to all the TV you could watch in the world, and for other people, they find TV to be a brain-deadening experience, and they would rather spend much more time in nature and or something else. But to come back to my question, and what's the alternative to competition?
John, it's
though?
not posed correctly, in my opinion.
Okay, so
who are these some people? Do you have children?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so should they have the benefit of free access to drugs? Not to mention a lot of TV things. Do they go to pornographic movies? Well, of course they don't, because you say that some things are not socially acceptable in your household,
right?
And maybe in your neighborhood.
That's my job as the parent.
Exactly.
So I don't know that I want the state to be my parent as an adult, though. So
well, it depends on whether you propose that the state act on your behalf, which it must, by the way. I mean, there's lots of things you can't do on the streets of New York, which are because they're socially sanctioned, and it's the state's job to try to prevent people who do that from doing it again. I don't mean just drugs and all that. You can't do lots of bodily functions in New York City.
I can't buy a toilet that doesn't require me to flush it more than once.
Exactly. Exactly.
It used to work.
And doesn't use up a huge amount of water, which is very important.
The state tells me I can't do or can do that. I think we can argue about, but I mean, is that the?
No, I agree with that. I'm not saying that the state is the ideal.
And I'm not trying to put that on you, but I am looking for. You've been a critic. You've criticized competition, and the social discord and the strife that it creates for all sides. So is it cooperation, or like what is the other approach that you're
why should it be 0-1?
No, maybe it's not.
I mean, nobody does zero. It's not.
What is that then? How should I think about what the kind of world that would take the implications of your critique seriously, and what does it look like? What does your ideal look like?
And let's start with what the real is. because I'm not a big fan of ideals. Engineers tend not to do that. But let's start with the real. It's pretty well established that every country in the world that is rich now, when they were coming up that ladder, intervened in the market in substantial ways. Oh, the U.S. protected nascent industries. So did England. So did Switzerland. So did France. So did Germany, in order to make themselves competitive on the world stage. What Jun Chang, I mentioned at Cambridge University economic historian, points out that this was the normal path that they took in order to climb that ladder. And in fact, he even cites, I can't remember who it was, Grover Cleveland or someone who says, of course that's correct. We'll be in favor of free trade when we get to the top. And that's why the phrase kicking away the ladder means. If it benefits us, we're in favor of it. If it doesn't benefit us, we're opposed to it. But some things that benefits us, don't benefit others. So how do we mediate that? We can't just say, well, our group, our family, our ethnic group is the only way I measure it. That's not a social. That's not a liberal way to look at it. And that's important. Liberalism had as a component of it the idea that you should not impose on people things that they're opposed to. Well, economics imposes on people. And liberalism has always had that, by the way, that component. The social welfare state was originally part of a liberal movement, in Europe at least, to deal with the damages caused by capitalism. So I'm in favor of that. That does not mean that I just blindly suppose that the state can do it. I mean, I look around, I see who the state is. So it means that we have to figure out some ways to deal with the worst of these things, maybe to prevent people from suffering those consequences. That's what a minimum income does. Andrew Yang, right? But maybe it's something stronger, that we need to keep communities going without the depredations that can come from job loss or lower prices. We don't want lower prices for cocaine. That's pretty clear. But I'm not sure I want lower prices for many things. What I want is to see a good standard of living, not this perpetual, what's the right word, a perpetual desire to constantly improve. A lot of people are saying this now, John. You know that. What about the environment?
I know they're saying it. I can't say that I agree with it. But so I do agree. But what about the environment? People say, well, that's, the Anthropocene. That's just absolute nonsense. I teach long-term history, and one of the things I say is, look how well capitalism is done in increasing standard of living. Look at this growth rate in standards of living. But the dual of that growth rate is that it's not just done by people, it's done by firms. They are the active actors. And of course, every conservative says, of course, they're the active actors. Well, you can't have it both ways. They're the active degraders, too. It's not because I drink out of a plastic bottle, which I don't anymore, but it's because they produce them in the millions because it's cheaper. And I'm not blaming capitalists. I'm saying that they're caught in the same trap, but they can't get out of the trap on their individual incentive. There has to be social discussion of this. And it's never been different. I mean, it makes it sound, well, we don't want the state. The state has always been part of the discussion. There's never been any social system without a state. And I agree that states are not ideal most of the time, perhaps even all of the time, but it doesn't mean that they don't perform really crucial functions. I think I'm trying as I'm listening to you lay out sort of your thought process. I'm trying to think about how best to enter into the spot where we probably are diverging the most. Because I definitely I agree with a lot of your observations, but I think one of the most fundamental things that I disagree with you on is
okay. But let me just ask you a question,
please.
Because this is a question about the boundary. When I mentioned the Nazis, I didn't mean that that's the only time people say no. what I meant is it defines in a sharp way the boundary.
Sure.
The boundary, outer boundary, but we're always saying no for lots of things.
Well,
and those boundaries shift according to politics.
Well, one of the things I think you and I agree on is I think we actually agree on a lot of things. So
yeah, I think we do actually.
And I've actually become, in some respects, I've been engaged in these kind of ideas in a really intentional way for about a decade now. But it's mostly been self-directed, and the film I just made with Arthur Brooks, The Pursuit, tackles these subjects in different ways. Through his lens, and it's really very much about his approach. But one of the things that spending time with Arthur did, because I went so far down an economics rabbit hole, was bring me back to weighting moral concerns.
Right.
And keeping them in the mix and keeping them in the foreground. He has this phrase, morals come before markets. And he doesn't mean that is a criticism, but I think he says that in the same way that you're describing, which is to say that, yes, there can be markets in methamphetamines, but
right.
the fact that there's supply and demand for that doesn't make it good. And, and our company is called Emergent Order, and orders right. can emerge that are bad, communities that are bad for individuals. And so I think I deeply share with you that concern, when that concern is absent, there's a path to bedlam.
Absolutely.
There's a door that's open there.
The path to the bottom, all those movies you see after the end of the world, and there's nothing but violence, and I totally agree with what Arthur Brooks said, which I hadn't heard before, but morals come before markets. So that's basically what I'm trying to say.
But I think my path into the way I think about economics is very different, because I didn't encounter, aside from that silly high school class, I didn't encounter these sterile models. I came into it through Hazlitt and Hayek and
right.
And in that Austrian, more and Hume and Smith, and so in those, when you look at that sort of that thread of thought, call it just classical liberal thought. Although I think that's probably forget the label. There's no good way to label anything.
Right. No. Yeah. Of course.
What you end up, I think, is in a very different place, and so it starts. To me, my understanding starts with something pretty simple. It's very, very Mises.
Right.
Each one of us has purposes, has a desire, has some end in mind, some better life. For me, and it changes over time, but we seek to improve our condition. And unless you're sadomasochist, or even in that case, you're seeking to improve your condition as you understand it. And so with that, that's the first sort of assertion, is that we, generally speaking, unless we really have some kind of psychological trouble where we might need, outside assistance, especially as an adult, we want to make our lives better, and better is subjective. It is our own definition. So for one person, better is having a large home to spread out and to do different things, and to have a workshop, and to have a big family. And for another person, it's to live in a tiny house and to only have one child or no children at all. And so that we start there. Then we are faced with, and this is to me where I think we maybe start to differ. We're faced with this reality that we are, yes, we are born into our present moment. We're not born into some abstract past. But the basic state of nature is poverty. The thing we have to explain, to me, in economics is not is how do we actually escape the 100,000 years of the state of nature that is virtually universal poverty. because that's the world in which we enter when we enter it. We enter it as these ridiculous little helpless babies that can't do anything and need to be cared for. And so we have this world of scarcity around us. And scarcity for now, until there's fusion-based Star Trek, 3D printer holographic things or something. We have scarcity.
And then you better say goodbye to capitalism if that happens.
Well, yeah, then maybe, all of a sudden, if you don't have, you eliminate scarcity. Once you have Star Trek replicator and it's like Earl Grey hot,
right.
You got all the distributional questions go away. The replicators can replicate replicators, and we've got a whole different set of problems. Or we got a lot of solutions and a bunch of new problems. I think search for meaning gets even more complicated. But at the center for me, and this is where I think I disagree with your thesis about the nature of competition, is what is Say's law of markets. And Say's law of markets is this super geeky thing. It's also that most people have never heard of. And if you have heard of it, you've heard of it in its bastardized form that John Maynard Keynes put forward, which is supply creates its own demand. And that's not Say's law of markets, but it sounds ridiculous. So if I make an apple pie, by making an apple pie, I create demand for apple pie. That's what it sounds like. But that's not Say's law of markets. It's that demand, our ability to demand things economically. Not to desire them, because we have all kinds of unlimited desires, but to actually go to someone else and trade with them is our ability to create. A good friend of mine said, and again, I am an unabashed capitalist booster, so forgive that. But capitalism is the only moral. I love this phrase. Capitalism is the only moral system because it is the only one that requires you to give before you can receive, and that's the law of markets. So we get richer by figuring out how to create more for other people. That's how we get richer. How do wages go up? By improving how each of us as an individual can create more value for others. And that to me is the mechanism that caused the world we have to come into being. It's not contention. It's not. I'm not disagreeing that history includes moments and battles and it's lumpy. And when you live in a steel mill town and there's only one employer and it's really hard and expensive to move and you can't because you're poor and you all you do is work for the mill or for the mine. All of that's true. I'm not trying to sandblast that away. But what I'm saying is the way we get wealthier and the way we increase our own incomes is by becoming more productive. And we use technology for that, and we use improvements to the way we understand the world. We create knowledge, and so we learn how to get better at creating value for others, and we compete to create value for others. And the value of competition is competition. It not just incentivizes us to create value for others, but it helps us become better at it. So when Apple figures out how to create that iPhone better, faster, cheaper, it is not a race to the bottom, but it is just part of that process of helping other people improve their lives while conserving as many resources as possible. And the flip side of that, the how does that not become the race to the bottom, is the other part of Say's law of markets, which is when I figure out a way to do more with less and increase my income, that gives rise to other jobs and other opportunities. So when I'm a farmer in 1840 and a tractor comes along, it destroys a bunch of jobs. But it also means I can produce 4 times as much grain. And that means that I actually don't need to work as long. I don't need to have my son work on the farm. I can send him to school. And so the increased output that comes from innovation and competing to improve, because you need those two things. Otherwise, you just keep all the gains for yourself. The competition spreads the gains around to everyone. That is what allows these improvements that politics often then follows and stands on top of. Like, we can't just all will ourselves to have $100 an hour pay. All right, so that's my story.
Yeah.
It's not that competition doesn't hurt. It's not that competition is always pretty. It's not. And I agree with your observations that in any given individual case, competition is war. But to me, the argument for capitalism is that it is nothing more than a way of harnessing competition to be in the service of others. And when that is what's going on, that is what makes us better off.
Okay, so I'm trying to list of all the things you said, and I sort of half agree with everyone, but I disagree also with it. Let me start with something about this whole business of the past being abysmal poverty before capitalism comes on. Now, that's quite true. But if you look historically, you begin, and this is something I'm writing in your book, so I have had to do this reading, which I enjoy. You begin by noting that the earliest forms of society, what we call hunter-gatherer societies, and they are, in the proper sense, primitive. Some of them are actually pretty good for the people. In the Kalahari, the hunter-gatherer tribes live quite well because they have like 60, 70 plants that they can do, and they work, 6 or 8 hours a day, 6 sometimes, and they don't need to work anymore because their lifestyle is good. Others, brutal warfare, so it's not idealizing it. But what's interesting is that when agriculture comes along, and this is exactly the question of your innovation, it's an innovation. It allows you to get much more output with the same labor, but it also allows people who can take control of that process to make you work much more than what you did before and get even more output and keep it for themselves. Now, that's an absolutely well-established property of agricultural societies.
My sort of stylized story, and I want to caveat it in a way that, what you've described in our conversation involves a lot of rich reality. And I sort of set myself up in a way that's disadvantageous by being a little more abstract. But I hope you can appreciate it. I'm not thinking in those abstract terms. I'm actually thinking very specifically about how any individual, we can, seeks out to improve their life and improve their lot and their station. And that some of these competitions and these contentions that exist, I think one of the other pieces that you didn't touch on is the way in which firms and workers are competing with each other in ways that are not so obvious from your story. So, for example, I worked at a large media company, and it's hard to find great people. It is. It's very difficult. I'm an employer myself. We have a little business, but even in Viacom, we had, I personally experienced advocating for and getting pay raises for producers that worked in my department, because they were great. And why did that happen? Because we weren't a union shop. It happened because we weren't the only game in town, and they got better offers elsewhere. And so workers compete with each other. And they also compete on the basis of the value they can create. And if you're able to create a lot of value and you're at a firm that doesn't think you're worth it, in a reasonably robust modern economy, you're gonna find somebody else who can. And I think when we tell the story from the worker's perspective, as if it's always in this sort of like company town vision where there is no other choice or option. I mean, I think in a way the most typical scenario where there is no other choice or option is actually the kind of subsistence grinding poverty that we see in some of the places that haven't experienced stable property rights and markets and business development. Countries that have struggled usually because of corrupt government and oppression. To allow those things to take root and allow that sort of market process to help people sort of discover the ways they can create value. And so I know I sound kind of cornucopian, but that's kind of at the heart of it, with the process that I see unfolding, that I feel is in conflict with some of your story in important ways. So I'd love to just hear you react to that.
Let me start by saying that when I preface my argument by saying that capitalism has created more wealth and raised the standard of living more than any other society in human history that we know of anyway. I don't know about Atlantis, but anything that we know of. So, for me, that's a point of departure. And it comes about because capitalism is driven, in my opinion, not by creating value, but by creating profit. There's a difference between those two things. The profit is enormously powerful. It's like a nuclear fission process, but it also has side effects which can be terrible. Not just periodic depressions and, what Hayek says won't happen if you have proper finance. I think that's all false. So we didn't really talk about that. But a good part of my book is about tracking these long waves and short waves and showing that they're really signatures of the way the capitalism operates, regardless of who's in power, which country, whatever. So, also Great Depressions. I mean, in business cycle literature, they themselves called certain periods Great Depressions. And those roughly occur every 40, 50 years, going back to 1810 or 1790. And you can track this, by the way. I show in my book the data. People tend not to look this far back because we take for granted what is recent, but it's not true. So for me, approaching it scientifically, I see, okay, here's a pattern. At this moment, I'm not concerned whether I want to call this pattern good or bad. I want to understand what causes it. And that leads me back to exactly the point I began with capitalism is not about creating value, it's about creating profit. And sometimes the profit, and often the profit perhaps, is extremely powerful in innovation and raising standards of living, but other times it is very destructive. I mean, Schumpeter is not saying this abstractly when he says creative destruction. He says, well, that's good on the whole. And perhaps that's right. But it is also terrible if you happen to be on the destruction side. And you cannot blame people for saying, well, I've had enough. They have a right. They have a right.
It sounds like what you're arguing for is stasis, and I don't want to misrepresent.
No, I'm not arguing for that at all. Not at all.
So if I work in a coal mining town in Kentucky, or I work in the textile factories in North Carolina, and because of the end of Maoism and the opening of trade with China, you now have textiles being made far more cheaply in China or Bangladesh or wherever, right. and my industry goes away. No question. So that's the creative destruction of trade, right? Right. You could the exact same process would happen if a robot is invented that can produce textiles dramatically better than
right.
human factories. So the difference between trade and technology is there really isn't really much of a difference in some if I'm on the receiving end of the destruction.
Right, I agree.
Well, I don't discount that at all. I have met folks who have had their lives devastated by industrial transformation like that. My wife's entire family is from the Detroit area.
Right.
So they've seen it and experienced it in their families firsthand. But which of these changes should be stopped or slowed? Because that to me is the fundamental question when we say there is these downsides to competition. The immediate next question I have, and I have this for you, is, okay, yes, it is hard on the auto industry when Japanese cars come in and they're cheaper and better. But that's happening all of the time. Every time someone invents something new, that happens. And who is in a position to meter that? And what system would, other than freedom and freedom of exchange and dynamism and rolling with the punches, even though they hurt, I don't see an alternative where we have wise deciders that can meter and slow this. And I know the short answer will tend to be, well, democracy. But, majority rule is often wrong.
Absolutely.
It's not necessarily wisdom. So why should I want that? Is that really the answer?
Okay, let me start backwards here. Things we agree on. Majority rule is often wrong. Well, hell, anybody who studied democracy would learn that lesson pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But
recent democracy, in fact.
Right, recent democracy, and unfortunately, probably future democracy. On the other hand, it also is true for me that markets can be often wrong. So the difference between us is not about the sort of abstract faith in democracy or the state, which I certainly don't have, but that my lack of faith extends to the market and yours does not. And I think that's a dividing line.
I think this is really great because it sharpens. I think this is maybe an area where we can explore what I think is some of the differences I try to understand and try to empathize with people who I think you and I share.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want the world to be a better place. And there's places where we differ on the means. So you're talking about the market.
Only because you pose it that
way. In a way that's like an abstraction.
No, but you posed it in terms of the market, John. I don't actually use that term.
Yeah.
I say capitalism. So
capitalism. Yeah. But I guess I hate the term capitalism because it suggests that if freedom, economic freedom of adults to exchange with each other consensually, is somehow a system that benefits capital, whatever that means.
Well, I can tell you what it means.
Well, there's all kinds of capital, right? So when I invest in myself and learn and improve my skills as a director or a video editor, I'm generating human capital. So I guess in one sense you could say, yeah, capitalism is a fine term. But I think capitalism is doesn't have a mind. There's no choice. There's no being capitalism that decides things. But when you say, well, okay, we have this creative destruction process, what is the alternative to individual freedom that's going to have this emergent outcome that is creative destruction?
Okay, but look,
to meter that process, that's the part that there's an intervention that's implied by what you're suggesting, and I'm not sure how we end up with a good intervener that's wise and makes good choices. And maybe I'm projecting too much. I want to understand that part.
I am talking about what I'm talking about is not taking any one of those three as being above the possibility of making really bad decisions for long periods of time. I mean, we agree on democracy, right? We agree on the state.
Yeah, no question about it.
The disagreement is that somehow for you, the market is an abstract entity, and for me, it is not. It's a concrete series of processes in which individual people who are, within that nexus make decisions, and that's regulated by profitability. If they make the wrong decisions, then they lose their place. If they make the right decisions, they might get promoted and move up and go to a bigger thing and so on. Or they may get sick of it all and drop out and live in Colorado or wherever. Used to be California, but that's no good now. So that is the difference.
I'm not sure if that's right, though, Anwar, because I think if you say, so you're saying democracy, I think, is no more or less an abstract description of a process than capitalism.
I agree. So that's the point. I'm saying when we talk about democracy, there's a certain set of decisions people under certain circumstances. I mean, that's all it is,
there's
right?
a process. It's fundamental at the baseline. I mean, I'm not an anti-democrat, but at the baseline, it's my understanding, simplistic as it might be, is that democracy at the end of the day is majority rule.
Well,
and there's lots of different ways you can get to.
No,
that.
but see, this is not right. This is another place we disagree. Democracy, if it was majority rule, would be majority rule, but democracy is cosseted and constrained by all sorts of things, beginning from Mill and before, that prevent you from doing with majority rule what be damaging to other groups, right? I mean, it doesn't always work. We agree that it doesn't work. Perhaps it doesn't.
Well, when you say these are all the sort of the constraints on democracy, though?
The constraints that we desire on democracy. We say, look, you don't have a majority rule to hang other people, as was done historically. You don't have majority rule right to take their homes away or take their religion or suppress their other crucial aspects of their being. You don't have that right even through a democracy. And that
these are what you call the Bill of Rights. And in the U.S., it's like those are the Bill of Rights. Congress shall pass no law that inhibits the freedom of speech.
But I'm a liberal in the sense of Mill then.
Yeah.
Who says these are really essential attributes which we must have in democracy. And we know, God knows, that democracies overrun those. Hitler was elected majority rule.
Oh, yeah. So was Chavez and his...
Yeah. So the point is, democracy, we want democracy to have at least an expression of the majority sentiment, but we also want it not to have the right to put that in every arena. I mean, I don't think there's any disagreement between you and me on that.
No question about it. No, I agree. Although I think this is an area where perhaps I would part ways with other folks on the left, because I think that democracy is often treated as a kind of end unto itself, not a process, and that if democratic outcomes are kind of ipso facto good.
Well, I doubt that Arthur Brooks would say that. Would Arthur Brooks say that?
No.
I don't know of anybody actually who, I mean, yes, at the kind of vulgar level, but I don't know anybody who's serious about democracy would say that.
Yeah, I'm strawmanning there slightly. But for example, we now are seeing an increasing desire to constrain the freedom of speech in this country under the guise of a fairly amorphous concept called hate speech. So that is an encroachment on one of these very classical liberal sort of firewalls around democracy, which is to say, look, if you say something that offends me or that is even broadly offensive, you're probably a bad person, or you're doing something wrong, but democracy doesn't get to tell you otherwise.
Well, see, but that's in my opinion exactly what Mill would oppose, wouldn't he?
Oh yes, for sure.
I mean, the whole point of being a liberal is to say I'm a ACLU liberal. I mean, I don't want to constrain even Nazis into the level of speech.
You and I are in in lockstep on that, and I'm only meaning to say that I think it's not. I think this is an area that's especially important for the conversation we're having. That there's fairly strong forces that are saying no. This is a world. This democracy should be ungated here and be allowed to have its way with this area of the social.
And I oppose it. And I'm an academic, and I tell you, it's not a good position to be opposed to it right now, because there's a kind of mentality, burn the witch first, and then we'll discover whether he was in fact a witch. It's that great scene in Monty Python, remember? Where she's a witch, she's a witch.
Given that, I think, so come back to where you were.
So let me come back to the point, because we agree on that. We agree on this, right? Then the second domain of your discussion, which again I agree with, is that the state is not automatically to be taken to be bad or good. And that for me is very important. It's not automatically bad or good. The state, for instance, safeguards the right of capital, which is not to me the same thing as just the right to sell a product. It safeguards the right, the laws. And it safeguards some of the methods of competition. You can no longer go and burn down your competitor's warehouse, as you could do in the mafia, let's say, because there are laws. They prevent you from doing stuff like that. And I'm not saying they're always good, but they come for a reason, which is that if you don't restrict,
sure, no question,
you get back to the point of a kind of brutal state of nature, which the strongest can do anything they want. And we want to prevent that.
Yeah, and I think we would both agree with
I think
that,
we would. I don't think there's really
if you love John Locke and believe in the importance of private property, you need some mechanism to enforce that. And you don't. There's instances of doing it without the state. Right. There's black markets. Right. There's all kinds of things. But by and large, in a large scale society, we have never seen something other than government be the adjudicator of
absolutely.
property.
And
no
I think that's there's not just that. There's the fact that the government steps in when one side or the other gets a terrible advantage. And that's what I meant about the conditions of work. To me, you asked me about how I got into economics. Well, that was one of the injustices that struck me when I actually read the history of how these things work, rather than the propaganda I was being fed in graduate school. The history of, this history is natural to me. I come from a very poor country where brutalization of people is absolutely common and taken for granted. But capitalism has shown that it doesn't have to be taken for granted. It is not natural, and it is social. Then if that's true, the historical development of capitalism gives us a clue, a very important means of understanding that. And it is not just about creating value for people. It is about people fighting against some of the consequences of that creating value, such as impoverishment, such as unemployment, such as poverty, such as starvation. These are facts, John, of the real history of capitalism. And I take that as an academic, as a scientist. That's my starting point. I have to understand that. And I have to support some of it. I don't support people working 14, 16 hours a day, though sometimes you and I probably do that. We do it voluntarily. Yeah.
More often than people probably realize.
Yeah, but the whip is different. We don't have to do it. We can drop out of the job, for instance, and still survive. So if we concede that that was a legitimate struggle, which for me is absolute bedrock, then you have to say that it is not true that all firms do is create value for others. It cannot be.
Well, I think that's a little. I don't think that's certainly not what I'm saying, right? So there is any individual firm or people may or may not be creating value for others. That we can only judge that by actually looking at the results. Obviously, you can have a firm that you can have a paper mill that is the most profitable because it dumps all of its waste into the river and poisons the neighbors down the street. And the fact that it happens to have a thicker bottom line than its competitors is not an indication of creating value for others. It's coming at an expense.
Okay, so that's an important point for me, because the question then becomes who judges the value, and it brings you back to the original issue you said. Who makes this decision? Mm-hmm. If the market just does it, and God knows we know that many, many environments have been totally destroyed by exactly the fact that it's cheaper to dump your stuff into the river or into the air than it is to be responsible for it. In other words, your personal individual cost is not the social cost. That's the first thing we learned in economics. Okay, if that's the case, then who decides? You cannot escape that difficulty that something or some process has to decide. And we are now in a state where, whole populations are turning against capitalism precisely because of this consequence, which has not come from any person's intention.
Well, it's an interesting thing. Are you talking? And I assume here you're talking about climate change.
Well, I'm talking about climate change.
Along almost every other dimension, and we've featured this in the video, the Kuznets curve, that even though I think it's being a little stylized.
It actually doesn't work anymore. The trouble with all economic curves is they cease to work as soon as you publish them. So.
But I know there's an academic from MIT, actually, who's talked about this recently, Andrew McAfee.
I don't know.
With his work on the Great Uncoupling. But basically, he actually looked at this just empirically. That there is a kind of there is a sort of Kuznets curve effect. So that yes, when you are a poor country with very little resources and you industrialize, you start to have a modernization technologically. It's very extractive. China and its air pollution, or the United States in the 1920s, or you go around the list. Every country that has to do that, at least up until now. But you reach this point where people by and large switch from valuing their kids' survival. Their kids are now surviving, and now they're worried about getting their kids into a good college, and so we kind of climb up Maslow's hierarchy, and the quality of the environment becomes in a sense, a luxury good, right? So along a lot of dimensions, the environment in wealthy countries has gotten dramatically better. I mean, we have more trees in the United States than we did 100 years ago. Our air is cleaner, and some of that's regulation, right? Some of that's
absolutely
capturing those externalities. But I don't think it's this necessarily inherent bug in quote capitalism per se.
I don't think it's a bug. It's an attribute. Whether you like it or not is a further question, exactly the question about the morals before the market or after the market. But it's an attribute. And my argument, it's an attribute because competition drives firms to seek the lowest cost, as you said. And that means they push the impact onto wherever they can. And that's just, I'm not saying that I'm opposed to capitalists. I feel sorry for them in some sense because they have to do this in the same way that a soldier in a war, a good person, an honest person, a kind person, will have to kill as many people as he can. So this is not a human thing. This is a social context thing. And that's important for me because then it's not about humans. It's about social structure. And we agree, both of us agree, that it can do bad things and it can do good things.
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess I think that capitalism, and by that I simply mean sort of a free market, where there is no sort of where the vast majority of decisions are they're regulated by a relatively simple rule to don't steal or hurt anyone else in your pursuit of your own ends. That's basically.
And don't hurt the environment. What about that?
And sure, and there's. Don't hurt the environment, I think is fine as well. Although it's an interesting thing. That's an interesting evolving process because what constitutes hurting quote the environment. But I'll concede that for sure. Don't pollute your environment. Don't hurt other people or take their stuff. And if you're an adult, have at it. That's my definition of capitalism. So in that definition, which people can push back on and say is insufficient and lacking a bunch of things, bad outcomes are kind of a result of the people being bad.
I don't think so. I don't think it's bad people. It's so funny because I have a better opinion of capitalists than you do.
I don't mean capitalists. I mean consumers. To me, the engine, what defines the outputs in a capitalist society is what people want.
John, that's absolutely not true. I mean, look, I don't know how much TV you watch.
We might be getting to the core of where we disagree.
Yeah, one of the differences.
This might be the essential disagreement, because this is my contention, and it would be straight out of Mises. And I hate to sound this because I'm very much not the kind of Chicago school style thinker on this stuff, but the consumer, the buyer, the customer defines the outcomes. They are the ocean that designs the ships.
I totally disagree with that, and that's very important for me, because now we've really identified a point of sharp disagreement. The rest of it has been, one side or the other.
Well, this is probably where it all hangs or doesn't hang together, and this is exciting. So how can you say that's not true? There's so many powerful firms that come to the table, come to market with enormous power and unlimited war chests, and release a product that nobody wants, and 6 months later it's discontinued.
Well, it's not like nobody wants, but that other people can do better or too. I mean, there's a big difference there, because it's also, you cannot leave out the battle side. Yes, it's true. You produce something that nobody wants. You can produce something that everybody wants and still get killed.
Or that folks don't want at the price you're able to produce it for, or whatever.
So that's a different story. Yeah, but keep in mind,
that's the essential one.
But one of the things I told you, that when I took Beckler and Vickery's courses, one of the things that I found highly improbable, or actually highly untrue, was the idea that people's preferences are somehow lodged in their genes and their brains, and they have, choices that they make among this or that on the basis of these embodied concrete preferences. That's absolutely false. When you look at the history of any society, but especially capitalist societies, you see how much they influences from capital, from firms, from advertisers, create demand. They don't just sit around waiting for you to buy an iPhone. They spend a lot of time pushing it and pushing other things out, by the way. But that is what it does. That's what it's good at. But that means that you cannot, it's completely false to say that the consumer is king. And this is what, I'm not an Austrian or a neoclassical either. I mean, Hayek and von Mises said many, many things, powerful things about how the system actually works. But they then go back to this bedrock that capitalism serves the consumer. In my opinion, it's completely false. So there's a dividing line, right?
So your first point is that we get brainwashed by advertising, which is not a very sympathetic. I don't know how we escape that then, because if we're all
I'm not saying. Look, it's a different question. Escape is to understand. We understood gravity long before we figured out a way to escape it. So you have to understand first.
I don't know how we've even survived then, because we're sort of brainless automatons waiting for somebody to pitch us something.
No, I didn't say that's taking it too far, but it's certainly true that we're heavily influenced, in my opinion, by the constant drum of advertising. I mean, how many minutes in a commercial, in a show, Rachel Maddow, which I sometimes watch when I can stop grinding my teeth at her, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it was. I'm old enough to remember that was like 5 minutes. How about those obnoxious commercials that come on every time you turn about people smiling and jumping up and down because they got a drug for a disease you've never heard of? And the ad is talking about and showing them laughing and doing things. In the meantime, there's a voice saying, but of course your legs may fall off, you'll get cancer, your hair might come out, and a few people will have this and that. And why is that so effective? Because the visual stimulus is more effective than the oral one. The oral is very boring, and deliberately so. Look, I have a lot of faith in advertisers. I don't think they're stupid. I don't think they do things thinking is not going to have any effect. On the contrary. And it's surprising to me that you would think that they don't have an effect. We create consumption patterns.
I guess it's funny because I've spent a fair amount of my professional life in and around advertising. So,
I know. That's why I'm saying this.
And I guess to me, it's always been striking the extent to which what you think is going to be an incredibly powerful ad campaign just doesn't work.
Oh yeah, sure.
And that advertisers are, what exactly, Anwar, is the difference between an advertiser and you or I trying to make our point in a conversation with each other? We're trying to be persuasive. We're trying to find an entry point that will click in the mind of the person we're talking to and get them to change their mind. I mean, how is that any different than an ad?
Trump is an advertiser, and he's damn good at it too, by the way.
Oh, he's unbelievably intuitive.
Yeah, and he's a salesman, and he was a good salesman, even though he failed a lot of times. Speaking about the market, by the way.
Terrible manager of actual enterprise.
Not good at the market, but he made a lot of money anyway. Okay, so let me tell you a story. When I was in graduate school, Robert Solow was once criticized, possibly by me, I can't remember, but criticized, saying that all these advertising things are pulling on people. And he said, no, they don't do that. They just pull you in one direction. So you go from one good to the other. And it struck me that was mistaken because it's reducing advertising to one dimension, which is the direction. So if you think of two arrows, buy A or B, then it cancels out. But if you think of another dimension, which is buy, then A and B is just an aspect of the first one, which is that you should buy more. You should always try to get more. You should always, and this is a point you made, everybody wants to have more. I don't believe that. I
didn't say everybody wants to have more. I said everybody wants to improve their life in however they see it, whatever that means. Okay. Sometimes that means less.
And how they see it is dependent on this poll that says you can improve your life. And this is for children now. I mean, talking about children. They get hit with this early on. They're very impressionable. And they pick up this idea that you want this toy and more toys. You've taken a kid to a store with it. I mean, you have to basically put them in chains. Otherwise, they grab everything they could. And it's not true that it was always like that. I wasn't like that because I wasn't in that environment.
But, it's I don't disagree with that. Although, again, I don't. It's funny, Anwar, you've actually, it's, I didn't want to have this conversation about the rap video, but you've touched on some things that it makes me feel good that we at least sort of captured some of this argument well in the rap video. Yeah. I'll tell you my own personal story on this. So I worked essentially in advertising and television, and I worked for Nickelodeon. I've made commercials for SpongeBob toys.
Right. Wow.
So I know about this very intensely. I sent my wife and I sent our son to a Waldorf school where you sign a contract upon entrance that you will not expose your children to media.
How interesting.
Not just at the school, but at home as well.
Right.
And the reason I did that, and we did that, is because, and I'm partly agreeing with you here, but also partly showing that we still have agency to make choices for how we're going to interact with all the persuasion we encounter in the world. So
that's right.
So I don't disagree that advertising is potent, that it's professional, that it's, it's backed by research, it's backed by psychology. Good advertising is incredibly persuasive. But I don't see that as a bug in or I don't see that as a negative thing in capitalism. It is simply a fact of the world of creative expression. It is just another part of the persuasive arts.
But John, that's got to be dependent on what you're applying it to. I mean, we just have this big thing about opioids, right? Juul is in a lot of trouble because it's a damn good advertising, which created a horrendous problem. Tobacco before that? I mean, if we fetishize this, then we can't pick up the fact that it's not just good, but also bad. And then we have to decide. You can't say who decided. You decided for your kids. And this, obviously, this school is responding to the decision by many people saying, no, they're going to be damaged by it.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, I've read that Waldorf schools are popular among Silicon Valley.
Of course. Not surprising, because they know how it works.
But to me, so I think this is maybe where we're...
But John, wait a minute. So you are interfering
I'm not sure
here.
I understand where we're differing here.
I don't think we're differing, except that my characteristics of what firms do, I don't believe that firms create value. They create profit. And that the difference between profit and value is very important because they're not the same. They're not all. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. I mean, Juul create profits, right? And vapes create profits. And marijuana is not going to create profits. Is that value? Well, because people will buy it. If you define value as what people buy, then you shouldn't be punishing your kid, because a kid deserves value.
So is this where we fundamentally disagree? Is it? I'm
not sure we disagree. You're putting your kid in a place where your kid is not allowed to help participate in value creation. I don't think you disagree with me.
But I guess to me, there's a couple different threads. So when we say that opioids have profit, but that's not value, there's a moral judgment you're making there about
Absolutely.
The choice, and you're using value in terms of morality.
Well, but you're saying it creates value. So then I say to you, well, what do you associate? I say it creates profit. So we agree on that. But the only question is whether you treat profit as equivalent to some definition of value. Because you don't need the term value.
I'm a subjectivist, so I do, because I think that fundamentally value is subjective.
Yeah, but it's social. It's social subjective. It's not so. Your kid's not born the desire for opioids or for toys. They play. You don't need. I mean, I didn't have toys when I was growing up. It didn't do me any harm.
I think social is one of these words that can be a fog. So I don't know what that means.
Well, I can tell you what it means, because you have to be more concrete. Yes, if it's abstract like democracy or firms or value, it doesn't mean anything. But if we're concrete, we begin to pick apart these distinctions. So we agree that firms create profit, right? That's their purpose.
They try to.
And then they don't survive. Yeah, well, it's a survival mechanism. It's their filter. And of course, they try to make profits. That's the bottom line, and they have to do that. But then the question is what meaning you attach to the profit. And here we may or may not disagree. We agree on quite a bit of that, actually, I think. We don't disagree that polluting the environment to create profits is something that you should take as generally good, even though it is good for profits. We know that.
Yeah, no.
Selling opioids is not good, even though it's good for profit. So we sneak in these judgments. And I say that we should make the judgments explicit by discussing them. I'm not proposing to impose them on you, but on the other hand, I don't accept that we can't talk about them.
Well, I think so. So let's focus on the opioids.
Yeah.
Because I think that where we probably would both agree is if we took benign consumer goods, like let's just take a set of meals that all have roughly equal...
chocolate.
Yeah, meals that have roughly equal nutritional content.
Right.
They are going to be valued differently, and the firms that produce those meals are going to have are going to experience different kinds of profits based on the consumer, based on what people like, and then based on how effectively and efficiently the firms can produce.
Well, here we already disagree, because it's what people can be persuaded to like. And persuasion is a softer term than, manipulated. What is persuasion? But it's persuaded to be liked, and that's what advertising does.
But how is that not then? How have you not stripped humans of agency in that critique?
Agency does not mean that you are a human. Humans are about social interaction. That's what we all are. I like chilies. Well, I grew up liking chilies, and I eat them. Sometimes people next to me go, "What the hell is that? I can't stand the taste." Well, I like it. So
I could eat pizza for almost every meal. So,
but I'm not. No one's born that way. You
there
get
are
socialized.
some things we are born with. We like sweets because they're high calorie. There's a lot of genetic.
Yeah, I agree. But
there's a lot of things that we're born with. In fact, I mean, Anwar, do you have any kids?
No, unfortunately, I don't.
Well, it is shocking the degree to which they are who they are from such an early age.
I agree. But I have a lot of pseudo kids. So yeah. Totally
I mean, any exposure to kids, the notion that we are born as a blank slate is an idea that I am shocked survives any common discourse among anyone with eyes, ears, nose, or a mouth.
And nobody, by the way, chimpanzees are not born a blank slate either. So this expression, I don't know where the idea came from. By the way, I don't know. Most cultures would never say that. This is one of those science myths that comes about and then gets, dropped. I don't even know where it did come about. Where does it come about, this blank state idea?
I don't know. I think it's, I do think it was perhaps part of this sort of early socialist progressive movement, the idea of socialist man and straightening the crooked arrow of man and all of that.
Could be. You could be right.
I don't know if that's the origin. There's probably always been a desire. It probably goes back to Plato and beyond. But it does sound it does sound like that's what you're saying when you lay all of our when you lay preferences, when you try to undermine the outcome, the value of individual choices.
But John,
say,
don't jump
that's
to
not
an
really
extreme.
Value. Well, but I'm partly to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
On the things that we have that are intrinsically human, intrinsically personal, yes. But that doesn't mean the opposite, which is that we're born with our preferences and clothing and habits and all of that determined. Obviously not. So if these are social, then advertising is part of that social persuasion process, right?
Our culture, our history, our family, everything about life is influencing our environment.
Right.
And we see these things ripple through our society. We see preferences change and trends come and go. And
we're not born with just preferences for sugar and sweet and a few other things. We're constructed also. And I don't want to go to the extreme of the blank slate, but I certainly don't want to go to the extreme of the fully determined child.
I think I have not heard what your alternative is to the freedom as I would define it as a libertarian or a classical liberal. The idea that, okay, look, I grant you all those things. We have our choices as an individual are bound up in our hopes and our dreams, our friends and our peers, and the arguments that are made and the advertisements that we see and the people we admire and what they want to be and do. And we seek these things out, and sometimes they let us down, and we get what we think we want, and we realize we didn't want it. And this is all happening in this for each individual, for all of us. And
again, you're internalizing this. This is where we disagree. Yes, it's happening for each individual, and some of those things you're doing harms some individuals and benefits others. And if you can't, no philosopher, no society would posit individuals who just their self-interest is the social interest. And that's a fiction of economic theory, which is why I moved away from it in the first
social
case.
Interest mean? I don't know what that means.
Okay. So here, people often talk about philosophers in Athens. Wonderful people walking around, thinking, sipping wine, shouting "Eureka" in the streets and all that. Maybe forget that 90% of the people in Athens were slaves. They lived off the sweat and blood of people so they'd have time to think. And the other 10% included people below ranks who had no option of this. And of course, no one's talking about women. So if you look at that society and you tell me how great Aristotle is and Plato is, I just cannot stand it, because that's only the thin top icing of a pretty rotten cake. And we're talking this earlier about, primitive societies were desperately poor and all societies before. It's just not true. It is true for the vast majority of the people. That's a great thing that capitalism done. Move those vast majority out of poverty. But Marie Antoinette was not poor. Neither was Queen Victoria, nor for that matter is Elizabeth I or II, nor all the people in her class. There was a real thing, class, by the way, and they were hugely benefited by the wealth that they could suck out of the people who were working for them, often in the most brutal and appalling conditions. Jared Diamond points out, in fact, that the hunter-gatherers' standard living goes down and the length of their working day goes enormously up to the point where they often suffer physical damage when you move from hunter-gathering societies to agriculture. But the agricultural societies are richer. They have culture and arts and all the things that we are products of. I can certainly say I'm a product of, but it comes at an expense. And they only very, very slowly do the benefits feedback over thousands of years to the people at the bottom. So that shapes my view tremendously. The facts of history.
But I don't understand. I think, but you're using this term social, and I'm not sure I understand where.
Well, there's nothing automatic about being a king. There's nothing automatic about having so much wealth that when people are starving in the streets, Marie Antoinette says, let them eat cake. I actually don't think that she meant that in a bad way. I think she was so insulated from the lives of the vast majority, 90% or more of her own people. And they're not her own people, but the people on whose back she stood, that she thought, if they don't have bread, why don't they have cake? I mean, everybody has cake. And I've seen this in the third world all the time. People say, well, I don't understand what they're complaining about. Why don't they just get a job or use their money?
Can I think if I can let me try to summarize what I think you're getting at here in a kind of abstract way a little bit. Okay. I think what you're putting forward with these specific examples is that we have the individual choices that we make, but that they exist in the context of the society, of the time and place in which we exist.
Yeah.
And that you
matrix.
Can't, and so you can't separate those choices from that context.
I think that's a fair statement. That's how I would put it.
Right. So is when you say social, is that the way in which you're pushing back against when I'm talking about individuals and individual choice? That look, yes, there's individual choice, but the choices you would make in the slums of India or the favelas of Brazil,
yeah,
are different in meaningful ways than the choices you make as a upper middle class creative person in America with a college education.
I think that's right. I said not only meaningful but fundamental. I mean, look, in my time already, I'm old enough to remember when no black person could be on television in anything except a demeaning role. I mean, it's not that long ago that it changed, by the way. The first Pakistani person or Indian person I've seen in the movies have been very recent. I don't know if you saw the movie about the Beatles. What is that called? There's a Pakistani boy who is mad about the Beatles. I forgot the name of it. It's a pretty good movie, actually, by the way. And the first time I've seen these things. And that's not because I chose this or that they chose not to appear in the movies. It's because the power of Indians and Pakistanis now has moved up as our wealth has gone up in this society. And our voice begins to be heard. Women, I mean, I don't have to tell you about women. Why were they never present? Or present only in a limited role? Why were their choices only to be beautiful or hardworking, but not as nasty as men? Well, I mean, that's pretty obvious why that is. And so when we talk about choices, I always say, in what context? Show me the context.
I guess the step, and I know we've had a very long conversation, and I appreciate
Yeah, we
it.
have. Sorry to keep you.
No. This has been a real pleasure, and I can't wait to next time I'm in New York for us to get together in person and continue this conversation. But
sure.
I not only grant the social context of individual choice, but I agree with you. What I don't understand is how that undeniable reality in any way represents a criticism of laissez-faire. And let me so how does that represent a criticism of laissez-faire? Because the alternative to laissez-faire is some level of government intervention, and those intervening people in government exist in the exact same social context, only now they're under control of a monopoly. And I don't see how that's going to do anything other than magnify and distort those decisions that are in that same social context, only now it's got the added layer of being having power over others.
Okay, so let's start with representation of criticism of laissez-faire. We know that the whole struggle, which is what I started with earlier, workers' rights, of the right to unionize, the right to work less than 16 hours a day, the right to work for more than $202.35 an hour, these rights were fought in the bitter battle with laissez-faire. And that's simply a fact of history.
I don't think that's a fact of history.
Well, then go back and look at how these labor struggles work. The welfare state came from the same fight.
There were these specific fights, but I think where we might disagree, or maybe not, is that the mechanism that allowed for those things to come to an end wasn't pickets, it wasn't fist fights, it wasn't collective bargaining. It was the underlying wealth creation that made it possible for those resources to exist.
I don't agree with this at all. I don't, because there's nothing in wealth itself that makes you want to give it away. In fact, if anything...
No, you don't need to give it away. You create it by being productive.
But the question is whether you keep it or whether someone else keeps it. I mean, the whole struggle historically is about the division of that value added. And that's it, John, it's a very well documented history.
Well, but incomes for the poorest people around the world have gone up, and have gone up pretty dramatically.
I agree.
Especially in the countries, I'm talking about for the bottom 10%. In the countries that are closer, no country's perfectly laissez-faire or perfectly centrally planned. But in the countries that are closer to laissez-faire, that have fewer top-down rules and regs, the bottom 10% have seen the biggest gains. So I don't.
No, that's not quite true. But anyway, let's apply that reasoning to the rise of the Soviet Union. When I was in college, there was already a real concern, which had sprung up in the 50s and 60s, that the Soviet Union would overtake the West because it was growing so fast.
Well, this turned out to be, if you can pardon my French, bullshit.
No, it didn't. No, that's not true. It didn't turn out to be bullshit. Tiger. They were growing much faster. They weren't able to sustain it. I mean, look, that's not a difficult thing either. The CIA was saying that. And they're usually not given to what's the word? Fantasy.
Paul Samuelson, I know Paul Samuelson had a graph in his textbook, which and he had to continually move the graph. It was the point at which Soviet growth would overtake the United States, and every year that they reissued his textbook, he shifted the curve further to the right.
You're missing the point. I'm not saying that it would do that. I'm saying that there was a concern because it was growing so much faster than we were, and that's a fact.
Well, the concern is a fact. The growth. Look,
growth is a fact. I don't know any serious historian who doesn't say that their growth was enormous in that period. Now, China is being called now a capitalist country because it's growing, but let me tell you, I was just in China, And all the attributes you say for capitalism are definitely not there. The state controls virtually every aspect of life, including what you watch and what you listen to. It has its own form of advertising. But that country is growing really fast. And that bottom 10% in China is growing faster than anywhere else in the world. So what do we make of that? You have to take these real things into account.
Well, I think as we wrap up, is there anything? I think we found a lot of areas of agreement, and I think we found a fair amount of places where we where we deeply disagree, even on what the facts are, and that's okay because these are complex subjects.
But these facts can be checked. I mean, the difference between you and me and people on this, I'll never talk to you again, is that we can check the facts. I mean, you remember the Samuelson curve, but there's a good, these are conservative historians who say, yes.
Yeah, no, I know. They were wrong, though, because people couldn't get toilet paper. So whatever that, this is one of these things about economics that I find
but this is one of the things about political discourse that I don't like. Many things in those countries were improved tremendously in the beginning, and moreover, they fought a world war which devastated them. 20 million Soviets died stopping the Nazis. If they hadn't done that, you and I both be speaking German now.
Yeah.
And that was a sacrifice they made. They lost a huge number of people and men mostly and suffered a terrible consequence, like Germany did, by the way, after World War I.
Yeah, I think this is one of these examples where part of where our disagreements come and where it's probably going to be hard in good faith to resolve them is when you have there is almost tautologically a problem with looking at growth in a centrally planned economy like the Soviet Union, because the underlying assumption when we talk about growth and talk about GDP is that you have market prices.
I don't think so. I think
it has
to
be, because otherwise I can just order. Here's my point. And I think maybe for our next conversation we can really drill into how we think about value. But the problem I have with the Soviet example and talking about Soviet growth or any growth in these centrally planned economies, or even to some extent the growth in China, is we're talking that numerically we're talking about GDP.
No. Wait, be careful here. I'm an economist and I don't use GDP growth for that kind of story. I like to look at, you talked about the standard of livings of the bottom 10%. Well, you're not talking about GDP growth there. You are talking about something concrete.
I think.
And that's what I'm talking about. If you look at the standards of living.
The Samuelson curve and the economists you're talking about and the growth that was concerning the CIA was GDP growth.
No, the CIA is much more concrete than that. But GDP can be done without any reference to market prices. It can be measured by indexes of quantity. I mean, real GDP is that, right? It's not about market prices. Market prices may decide the components of it, but it's adjusted for inflation. So it is, in fact, an index of quantity. And there is no doubt that the Soviet Union dramatically rose. I mean, Samuelson is one voice in there, though actually I remember him saying something different. But he certainly didn't believe it was going to overtake, but there were plenty of people who did. And in the 50s and 60s, that was a discourse. Now, it didn't overtake, as now people believe China is going to overtake, and probably it won't. But it sure closed a lot of the distance. Tsarist Russia was nothing like the Soviet Union. And if we don't admit that, then we are not able to really understand the goods and bads. And then it's ideological. I mean, really, if you do it scientifically, you really have to admit the goods and the bads. I'm not a supporter of the Soviet Union or of China for that matter. That does not mean that I simply say, well, it's all bad. And I'm not an ideological proponent of capitalism, but I would never say that it's all bad or even mostly bad. We need to find that middle ground.
And I think that is a fantastic place for us to bring our conversation to a close.
Exactly. Who would ever think I'd be a moderate?
I might be more radical than you, Anwar, and that's okay.
I think you are. You think you need to tone down, John. You're too radical.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Me too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.